He could command billion-dollar markets with a single decision. But tonight, Richard Hale couldn't convince his 8-year-old son to take a single bite. The restaurant was silent in that way only the rich can afford. Muted laughter, polished silver, conversations that never rise above a whisper. But all of that quiet made the child's humming sound louder, stranger. Ethan sat curled in the velvet booth, rocking back and forth, his untouched plate of butter-poached lobster growing cold. At the other end of the table, Richard's jaw was clenched so tight it trembled. He leaned forward, voice low and controlled, the way men speak when they're used to being obeyed. "Ethan, please. Just one bite. People are watching." He said it like a prayer disguised as a command. 2 tables over, a woman in pearls tilted her head and whispered to her husband. A man in a grey suit smirked. Phones glowed subtly, catching the moment like vultures waiting for a fall. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, platinum, engraved with his initials. Every detail about him screamed precision. The tailored navy suit, the calculated calm, but under the linen tablecloth his hands shook. He could close mergers before breakfast, erase competitors by lunchtime, and dine with senators by evening. But here, in this booth with his son trembling beside him, he was powerless. "Ethan," he tried again, voice barely holding steady. "Look at me." The boy didn't. He never did. His small fingers traced invisible patterns on the tablecloth, again and again, a ritual no one else understood. The hum deepened, rising and falling like waves no one else could hear. Across the room, a black waitress stood watching. Her name tag read Amara. 33, calm-eyed, her presence carried the stillness of someone who had seen too much to be easily startled. She noticed the boy's movements, the rhythm, the flinch every time a plate clattered, the way the bright chandelier lights made him shrink into himself. She'd seen this before. When she approached, Richard didn't look up. He waved her away the way rich men wave away noise. "We're fine," he murmured, already defeated. But Amara didn't move. She lowered herself to one knee beside Ethan's chair, her movements slow, measured. She didn't speak at first. She just hummed. A sound soft enough to blend with the jazz playing in the background, yet steady enough to reach the boy's world. It wasn't a nursery rhyme, not exactly. It was a melody her grandmother used to hum in the South, half lullaby, half prayer, a sound made of warmth and memory. Ethan froze. His rocking stopped. His small hands, always restless, fell still. Then his eyes, those wandering, unfocused eyes, lifted, searching for the sound. Amara met his gaze. No pity, no performance. Just recognition. She reached for his plate, picked up a small piece of lobster and began moving it in slow circles across the air, mimicking the same pattern Ethan had been tracing seconds before. The boy watched, transfixed. The food danced, the melody continued, and in that silent rhythm, something shifted. He reached forward. One bite. Then another. If this part moved you, take a second to like the video. It helps more people hear stories like this. But you're not the only one moved by this part, because even Richard's fork slipped from his hand. The clang echoed like thunder. Every head turned toward him, but he didn't care. He just sat there watching his son eat, his son who hadn't eaten in public for nearly a year. When Ethan finally looked up, the hum had stopped. The world felt different, softer, smaller, possible. For the first time, Richard noticed the woman beside his son, not as staff, not as background, but as someone who had just done what all his money, doctors and specialists couldn't. "Who are you?" he whispered. Amara smiled faintly, standing up with quiet grace. "Just someone who listens." Before he could reply, she was gone, back to the rhythm of trays and tables, vanishing into the anonymity that keeps service workers invisible. Richard sat frozen, the words still hanging in the air like something sacred. Someone who listens. That night, long after the restaurant lights went dark, he sat in the back of his limousine, watching the city blur past. Neon, steel, glass, all the things he owned, yet none of it felt like control anymore. His son slept beside him, head resting against the window, small fingers twitch as if still tracing that invisible pattern. For years, Richard had believed success meant order, systems that worked, numbers that matched, people who obeyed. But tonight, for the first time, he realized how fragile all of that was. He'd spent $500 million building an empire around learning, schools, educational tech, private institutions designed to maximize human potential. And yet, the one human being he couldn't reach was his own child. As the car turned toward their penthouse, he caught sight of his reflection in the window, the face of a man who could control everything but the connection. He remembered Amara's eyes, steady, knowing, unbothered by his wealth. There was something in her that unsettled him. Not defiance, not awe, just truth. He didn't know it yet, but that brief moment in a crowded restaurant had cracked something open inside him. The man who prided himself on understanding the world had just met someone who saw straight through it. And for the first time in his life, Richard Hale began to wonder if the problem wasn't his son's silence, but his own inability to hear. Stories like this deserve to be seen. Hit subscribe if you want more true human stories that stay with you. The next evening, Richard Hale returned to the restaurant. Not for the steak, not for the wine, not even for the privacy the maître reserved for his kind. He came because something had broken in him the night before, and for the first time in years he wanted to understand what. Amara was there again, moving through the tables with the same quiet grace. No rush, no pretense, no flinch when a glass shattered across the room. It was as if the noise of the world couldn't touch her. When she reached his table, Richard stood before she could speak. "You did something yesterday," he said. "Something I couldn't." Amara's voice was calm. "I didn't do anything magical, sir. I just listened." He frowned, confused. "Listened?" He didn't say a word. She smiled gently. Words aren't the only language. Ethan sat between them, staring at the table's reflection. His fingers traced invisible shapes across the polished wood. Amara crouched, not as a servant, but as someone meeting another human being on equal ground. She hummed that same tune, low, warm, familiar. Ethan's hand stilled, then followed the rhythm with a quiet tap. Richard watched, the corners of his mouth tightening. You've worked with kids like him before?" Amara nodded. "I used to teach children with autism before the program shut down." "Which school?" "Jefferson Elementary," she said, her tone measured. "It was one of the schools your company's foundation stopped funding." The words hung between them like static. For a second, neither spoke. Then she stood, collected herself, and said softly, "Would you like me to bring his food now?" That night, Richard barely touched his meal. He watched her instead. The way she anticipated each child's meltdown before it happened. The way she smiled at the cook who shouted. The way she existed, unshaken, unbent, in a world that dismissed her. Moments like this remind us what humanity still looks like. If you agree, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. When Richard returned home, his penthouse felt colder than usual. The walls were lined with art, the kind sold in silent auctions for more than most families earned in a year. He passed Ethan's playroom. White walls, perfect symmetry, designer toys untouched. He stopped at the doorway, watching his son sit motionless in the corner. "Ethan," he whispered, "what am I missing?" The boy didn't respond. But in the faint glow of the city outside, Richard saw the truth Amara had hinted at. It wasn't his son who didn't understand the world. It was him. Days turned into weeks. Richard began showing up at the restaurant without corporate guards or PR staff. He'd sit quietly, sometimes hours before Amara's shift began, just to watch. Not her body, her patience, her method. He started asking questions. Why does he cover his ears when people clap? Why won't he look me in the eye? Why does he seem calmer when you're around? Amara never made him feel ignorant, even when his questions carried privilege. "Because sound hurts," she explained. "Because eye contact isn't a connection for everyone. And because I don't try to change who he is, I try to meet him where he's already waiting." For the first time, Richard realized how many people he'd spent his life trying to change, employees, partners, even his own child, when all they ever wanted was understanding. One afternoon he asked her if she missed teaching. "Every day," she said, "but teaching doesn't pay rent anymore, especially not after your foundation restructured our grants." Her tone wasn't bitter, it was factual, almost merciful, but those words, "your foundation," hit harder than any accusation. He looked down, shame twisting through his chest. "I didn't know." Amara's eyes were steady. That's the thing about power. It keeps you from seeing the things your decisions crush. Something shifted after that. Richard stopped coming in suits. He traded his Rolex for rolled sleeves, his chauffeur for the subway. He began reading books on neurodiversity, empathy, and behavior. He even visited an old public school Amara mentioned, the one that had closed its special ed wing. He stood in its hallway, empty now, walls still covered with children's drawings, crude crayon faces smiling through the dust. One paper read, "Miss Amara makes my brain quiet." He folded it gently and slipped it into his coat. That evening, he told his assistant to cancel every meeting for the next 2 weeks. When she asked why, he said, "Because I've been running a company that doesn't know what it's destroying." He went back to the restaurant one last time. Amara was wiping a table when he approached her. "I want to fix what I broke," he said. She looked up, wary. "Mr. Hale, people like me don't wait for billionaires to save them." "I'm not talking about saving anyone," he said. "I'm talking about learning." She studied him, searching for the catch. For the PR stunt, the hidden motive. But there was none, just exhaustion and something new behind his eyes, humility. "All right," she said finally, "then start by listening. And if this scene caught you off guard, tell me in the comments what you would have done differently." The next morning, he followed her to a community center in Harlem, where she volunteered once a week. No cameras, no suits, no luxury cars, just peeling paint, flickering lights, and children whose parents couldn't afford therapists. He watched her kneel beside a boy who screamed whenever someone touched him. She didn't flinch. She simply held out a feather, waiting. The boy reached, touched it, and smiled for the first time that day. That night, Richard sat by his son's bed, humming the same tune Amara had sung. Slowly, Ethan's breathing softened. He turned, reached out, and rested his hand on his father's wrist. It was the first physical contact they'd shared in months. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by everything money could buy and none of what mattered, Richard Hale, the billionaire, finally cried. Not from failure, from recognition. He wasn't teaching his son to live in his world anymore. He was learning to live with his son. A small act changed everything. Sometimes that's all it takes. Like the video if you believe that still matters. But change rarely goes unnoticed, especially when it comes from a man who sits on the front page of every business magazine in America. For weeks, Richard Hale disappeared from boardrooms, press conferences, and investor dinners. The billionaire who used to sign deals worth billions was now spending afternoons in a Harlem community center, cleaning up spilled paint, laughing with children who couldn't look him in the eye. At first, people whispered. Then the cameras came. One morning, as Richard and Amara stepped out of the center, a tabloid photographer caught the image that would set the internet on fire. The billionaire, smiling, holding the hand of a black woman in a faded yellow dress, while a group of children gathered around them. By the next day, every headline had a version of the same story. Billionaire heir's secret obsession? Is Richard Hale funding his waitress mistress? The black woman who captured Wall Street's white prince. It didn't matter that none of it was true. It didn't matter that Amara was a teacher, not a mistress. The world didn't care about truth. It cared about scandal. At Hale Global headquarters, panic spread like fire. His PR director, a sharp woman in her 40s, stormed into his office with a folder full of printouts. "Richard, this looks bad. The board is furious. Your wife's lawyer is calling." He said nothing, scrolling through the headlines on his phone. Then his assistant entered, pale. "Sir, the foundation's donors are threatening to pull out." He looked up, calm but distant. Let them," she repeated. "Sir, your reputation." "It has been alive for years," he said. "Maybe it's time it burned." But his ex-wife wasn't as calm. That evening she arrived at his penthouse unannounced. Tall, elegant, perfectly composed, her presence carried the kind of quiet cruelty only privilege could polish. "Do you realize what you've done?" she said. "You're embarrassing Ethan. You're embarrassing all of us." He laughed bitterly. "You mean you?" She held up her phone, showing the tabloid photo. "You're in public, holding hands with the help. The black help. Do you think people won't talk?" Richard's face hardened. "She's the only reason I can talk to our son." His ex-wife's tone sharpened. "No, she's your newest charity project, and now I'm filing for full custody." He froze. "What?" "You're unstable," she said coldly. "You're parading our son around strangers, you're being exploited, and the press is eating it up. Ethan deserves stability, not whatever this is." She turned and left, heels clicking against marble. That night, Richard sat alone, scrolling through his son's photos, the same child the world wanted to use as evidence against him. He could almost hear Amara's voice. Power keeps you from seeing what your decisions crush. Now he saw it clearly. His power had crushed her once, and now it was about to crush her again. 2 days later, Amara was fired. The restaurant manager called her into the office, avoiding eye contact. "I'm sorry, Amara. You're good at your job, but this attention, it's bad for business." She didn't argue. She'd seen this coming. Black women always did. "Did you also see it coming?" Comment didn't expect that if this part surprised you. When Amara walked out, the cameras were waiting outside. "Amara, is it true you're seeing him? Are you after his money? Did he promise you a foundation?" She kept walking, head high, not saying a word, but silence only made them hungrier. By the weekend, talk shows dissected her face, her tone, her body language. Every smile became evidence, every glance an affair. She wasn't a person anymore. She was a headline, a myth, a target. When Richard found out she'd been fired, he drove straight to her apartment in Harlem. The cameras followed. Amara opened the door, weary but composed. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "They're destroying you because of me," he said. She shook her head. "They're not destroying me, Richard. They're reminding me who they think I am." "I'll fix this," he said. "No," she said. "You'll make it worse. Because you don't understand, the world forgives rich white men for their sins. It punishes black women for being seen." Her words cut deep. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he stepped back, eyes lowered. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know," she said softly, "but sorry doesn't stop the system that keeps doing this." What do you think Richard will do next? Well, the custody hearing came fast. The media turned it into a spectacle. The powerful ex-wife, the fallen billionaire, the autistic son at the center of a moral war. Reporters filled the courthouse steps. Inside, lawyers argued about image, influence, and appropriate parenting. Then Amara was called to testify. Everyone turned as she entered the courtroom, calm, unshaken, dressed in grey. The opposing lawyer smiled sharply. "Miss Lewis, are you currently employed?" "No," she said. "Did Mr. Hale ever offer you money?" "No." "Then why did you spend time with him?" Amara's voice didn't waver. "Because his son needed someone who could see him." The lawyer smirked. "And you're qualified to make that assessment?" "I was," she said, "until Mr. Hale's company defunded the program that trained me to do so." The courtroom went silent. Even the judge looked up. Amara turned toward Richard. He didn't know, but the decisions he signed on paper hurt real people, and now he's trying to undo it. The lawyer objected, but it didn't matter. The truth had already landed. When the hearing ended, Richard walked out not as a billionaire trying to win, but as a man finally ready to lose everything, if that's what redemption required. Outside, the cameras waited again. He ignored them. Instead, he walked to Amara, standing on the courthouse steps. "I don't know what happens next," he said. She nodded. "Then make sure what happens next means something." He smiled faintly. "Will you help me build it?" Amara looked at him for a long moment, then simply said, "Only if we build it right." That night, as the city lights flickered across his penthouse window, Richard Hale sat beside his sleeping son. The tabloids were still screaming his name, the world still guessing his motives, but for once, none of it mattered. Because in the silence he knew, his life had stopped being a story about wealth and power. It had become a story about repair. And repair, he realized, always starts with truth. If you're still here watching, you probably felt something too. Hit like, it tells YouTube to show this to someone who needs it. The courtroom fallout didn't end with a verdict. It ended with silence, the kind that follows a public storm, when the cameras move on but the damage remains. For Richard Hale, that silence was deafening. He returned to a world that had once worshipped him, now filled with turned backs and unanswered calls. His board voted him out of Hale Global within a week. His ex-wife won joint custody, but only on the condition that every decision involving Ethan required court approval. It should have broken him. But instead, something else began to take shape in the ruins. One night, sitting in his study surrounded by the ghosts of his former life, framed magazine covers, awards, and photos from charity galas, he picked up a folder Amara had once given him. Inside were letters from parents of autistic children she used to teach, crayon notes, misspelled words, messy hearts drawn beside her name. One line stood out. Miss Amara listens when the world gets too loud. That was it. The idea. The purpose he'd spent his life buying but never finding. The next morning, Richard held a press conference. Not from a glass tower or a private jet, from the old Jefferson Elementary School that had been shuttered for years. This building, he said, standing before the cracked walls, was closed because we thought it didn't make money, but what it made was humanity, and that's worth more than any stock I ever owned. Reporters whispered. Cameras clicked. I'm selling every controlling share I have in Hale Global, he continued. The proceeds will fund a new initiative, the Hale Foundation for Neurodevelopment. It will create programs for children like my son, and it will be led by the woman who showed me what leadership actually looks like. He paused, looked toward the crowd, and smiled faintly. Her name is Amara Lewis. The flash of cameras filled the air. For once, no one asked about the scandal. They asked about the possibility. Amara didn't say yes immediately. When Richard visited her again at the community centre, she was sweeping the floor. You don't need me for your foundation, she said without looking up. I don't need you, he said quietly. The children do. She stopped sweeping, met his eyes and saw something new. Not pity, not guilt, but respect. What exactly do you want from me? I want you to build what you always dreamed of, he said, without asking anyone for permission. That afternoon, she walked him through her notebooks, pages of ideas she'd been collecting for years, sensory classrooms, parent training programs, affordable diagnostic clinics. The kind of vision no investor had ever taken seriously. He didn't just listen, he took notes. And for the first time, Amara realized he wasn't trying to help her. He was trying to learn from her. Within 6 months, the first Hale Center opened. Not in downtown Manhattan, but in the heart of Harlem. The building was simple, bright, and painted in colors chosen by the children themselves. Every wall spoke a different language, drawings, music notes, textures for sensory learning. Amara's office didn't even have a door. She wanted no walls between her and the families. At the opening ceremony, Richard stood at the back, watching as children played freely for the first time in their lives. He didn't give a speech, he just watched. A reporter approached him anyway. Mr. Hale, how does it feel to lose your company but gain this? He smiled faintly. Feels like I finally invested in something real. Months passed. The centre grew. Dozens of kids enrolled, including some from schools Hale Global had once shut down. Ethan came too. He didn't like crowds, so Amara set aside a small room with soft lights and no noise. He spent hours there, drawing, stacking blocks, humming that same melody she'd once sung in the restaurant. One day, Amara called Richard into the room. I think he wants to show you something. On the floor, Ethan had drawn 3 stick figures holding hands. One tall, one smaller, one in a yellow dress. Above it, in shaky letters, he'd written, Family. Richard knelt beside him, tears threatening to break through. You drew us, he whispered. Ethan nodded once, still focused on his crayons. Amara smiled quietly. He sees you now. Richard looked at her. No, he said softly, you helped me see him. That night, the 3 of them walked outside together. Harlem was alive with noise, traffic, laughter, the pulse of a city that didn't sleep. But in that small pocket of calm between streetlights, it felt like the world had slowed down. Amara looked at him. You know they'll still talk. About you. About me. I know, he said, but for once they'll be talking about something worth saying. She smiled. Redemption doesn't erase what you did, Richard. It just proves you're willing to do better. He nodded. Then I'll spend the rest of my life proving it. As they stood there, a boy ran past shouting, Miss Amara! She turned, laughed and waved. Richard watched her. The same woman who once served him food, now serving an entire community. The same woman the world dismissed was now changing the very system that had ignored her. And in her reflection he saw the truth. The real power he'd been chasing all his life wasn't control. It was a connection. Years later, when journalists tried to tell his story, they called it the Billionaire's redemption. But that wasn't the truth, because redemption wasn't his alone. It was shared, built on the courage of a woman the world had tried to silence, and a child who had taught them both to listen. Stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us. Subscribe if you want to keep remembering. The final shot wasn't in a courtroom or a boardroom. It was in the centre's playroom. sunlight filtering through curtains, Ethan painting beside Amara. Richard was watching from the doorway, silent, humbled, whole. Some men spend their lives trying to buy meaning. Others are lucky enough to meet the person who gives it to them for free. Because the story wasn't about the man who learned empathy. It was about the woman who reminded him what being human really meant.